For days, Charlie Chaplin believed his unease was something he had created himself. A harmless fixation, a passing paranoia he refused to take seriously. Then a note reached his hands. There was no name, no explanation, only a quiet certainty. And in that moment, he understood something chilling. What he had dismissed as fear was, in fact, foresight. The unease hadn't started with the note. It had been there long before, quiet, subtle, and easy to ignore. Now it was growing into something else. Something that made him hesitate over decisions that should have been instinctive, second-guess choices that once came naturally. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by dreams of vast audiences whose faces remained hidden in shadow, watching his films with expressions that shifted between laughter and something far more calculating. Each morning, he arrived at his studio lot determined to work with his usual confidence, only to find himself making different choices by afternoon. The editing room, once his sanctuary of creative control, now felt exposed, as if invisible eyes were cataloging every cut, every decision, every moment of artistic judgment. The footage before him showed the tramp navigating an industrial landscape, caught in the relentless machinery of modern progress. It was meant to be both comic and pointed a commentary on how contemporary life could consume ordinary people. 6 months earlier, he would have laughed at his own creation. Now, staring at the frozen frame on his editing screen, he felt something approaching dread. Not because the work was poor, it was brilliant, perhaps dangerously so, but because it carried implications he was only now beginning to grasp. The factory owners in his film were portrayed as callous and profit-obsessed, caring nothing for worker dignity or safety. When he had conceived these characters, they had seemed like obvious targets for satire, representations of a system that valued productivity over humanity. But lately, watching the footage, he found himself wondering if these portraits might be understood as more than general social criticism, if they might be interpreted as commentary on specific individuals, particular ways of conducting business. It was January of 1933, and Charlie Chaplin was 43 years old, at the absolute peak of his creative powers and international influence. His previous film had been acclaimed on every continent, and this new project promised even greater artistic and commercial success. Yet something fundamental had shifted in recent weeks, some invisible alteration in the atmosphere surrounding his work that made every decision feel weighted with consequence. He paused the projector and walked to the window overlooking his studio grounds. Below, his employees moved, with the casual confidence of people who trusted their employer's judgment completely. Carpenters built sets according to his specifications. Actors rehearsed scenes he had written. Technicians prepared equipment for shots he had planned. They depended on him to make the right choices, to lead them toward work that would justify their faith in his vision. But what happened when the person making those decisions was no longer certain of his own instincts? The intercom crackled, startling him from his thoughts. His secretary's voice carried a note of curiosity. "Mr. Chaplin, there's a gentleman from the Chicago Tribune on the line. He says there's been considerable interest in your work there, and he'd like to schedule an interview." Chicago? Chaplin frowned at the speaker. Press attention from that city was unusual for him. His films played there, naturally, but he had never paid particular attention to Chicago's response any more than he focused on reactions from Boston or Denver or any other American city. What kind of interest? He mentioned appreciation among various business and social circles, sir. Quite enthusiastic appreciation, according to him. The phrase hung in the air strangely. Business circles. What businesses? Why Chicago specifically? And why did the idea of enthusiasm from that quarter make him feel more nervous than pleased? "Tell him I'll call back," Chaplin said, but made no move toward the telephone. Instead, he found himself staring out the window again, wondering about those business circles, about what kind of appreciation they might harbor for his work, and whether their understanding aligned with his artistic intentions. The thought was deeply uncomfortable, though he couldn't articulate exactly why. That evening brought another disturbing element to his growing unease. Chaplin maintained the habit of reviewing newspapers from around the country, a practice developed to gauge public reaction to his films and understand broader cultural currents that might affect his work. But tonight, almost without conscious intention, he found himself drawn specifically to publications from Chicago. The items were small, the kind of brief mentions that could easily be overlooked. A society column noting that prominent local figures had attended a private screening of his latest work. An entertainment brief mentioning how influential residents were discussing the sophisticated social commentary in his films. Another piece described a gathering where business leaders had expressed admiration for his mature approach to contemporary themes. Individually, these mentions were unremarkable, the sort of coverage any successful film might generate. But taken together, they created a picture of interest from quarters he hadn't expected and wasn't entirely certain he wanted. Who were these prominent figures, these influential residents, these business leaders? What had they seen in his work that merited such specific attention? The questions followed him to bed that night and invaded his dreams. He found himself imagining theaters filled with faces he couldn't quite see, audiences whose reactions he couldn't predict or control. In the dream, he stood on stage before these shadowy viewers, attempting to explain his artistic intentions, but his words seemed to carry meanings he hadn't intended, implications that escaped his control and took on lives of their own. He woke with his heart racing, sheets damp with perspiration, and the uncomfortable realization that his subconscious was processing fears his waking mind preferred to avoid. The next morning brought concrete validation of these abstract concerns. His business manager, Alf Reeves, arrived at the studio, carrying news that transformed vague unease into specific alarm. "There's been an unusual development regarding distribution," Reeves explained, settling into the leather chair across from Chaplin's desk with the careful manner of someone bearing significant news. "A theater chain from Chicago has made an offer for exclusive regional screening rights." "Exclusive rights?" Chaplin set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "That's not how we typically handle distribution." "Indeed not. And they're offering triple our standard rate." Reeves opened his briefcase and withdrew a contract thick with legal documents. No special conditions, no unusual requirements. They simply want to ensure first access to your next picture in their market. Most remarkably, they've paid in advance a substantial cash wire transfer that cleared yesterday. Chaplin studied the documents, searching for explanations that weren't readily apparent. The theater chain appeared entirely legitimate, well-established, financially sound, with a solid reputation in the industry. Nothing in their proposal suggested anything improper or unusual, yet the eagerness felt like something beyond normal business enthusiasm. "What do you know about the business climate in Chicago these days?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "Much the same as everywhere else, I imagine," Reeves replied with a slight shrug. "Difficult economic times, people seeking entertainment to escape their troubles, competition among exhibitors for quality product." "Why do you ask?" "Simple curiosity," Chaplin answered. "But it was far more than that." He was beginning to understand that his work had somehow attracted attention from people who might interpret it very differently than he had intended. His satirical portrayal of corrupt officials, greedy industrialists, and social inequality was being appreciated not just by audiences who shared his progressive ideals, but also by individuals who might recognize themselves in his villains and find that recognition amusing rather than condemning. The realization was profoundly disturbing. Art, he had always believed, should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. But what happened when the comfortable found your disturbance entertaining? What happened when the people you meant to critique became your most appreciative audience? Over the following weeks, as these questions gnawed at his creative confidence, Chaplin began noticing subtle changes in his own work. Nothing dramatic, he remained too committed to artistic integrity for wholesale alterations, but small modifications that he told himself were simply natural refinements, signs of developing maturity and sophistication. A scene depicting a corrupt politician was recut to emphasize the character's bumbling incompetence rather than his malicious greed. A sequence showing police brutality against striking workers was edited to highlight the comedy of confusion rather than the violence of oppression. A wealthy industrialist's callous disregard for employee safety was softened into mere absent-minded eccentricity. Each change seemed reasonable in isolation, motivated by legitimate artistic considerations. The corrupt politician was funnier as a fool than as a calculating villain. The police scene worked better when it avoided graphic depictions of violence. The industrialist became more human, more relatable, when his flaws appeared to stem from character weakness rather than deliberate cruelty. But taken together, these modifications began to alter the fundamental character of his film. What had started as sharp social satire was becoming something gentler, more palatable, less likely to make anyone genuinely uncomfortable. The edges were being filed away, the points blunted, the targets made less specific and therefore less threatening. Chaplin told himself this represented artistic growth, a developing understanding of subtlety and nuance. But in the quiet hours of the editing room, when he was alone with his work and his thoughts, he wondered if he was actually learning something less admirable: the art of creative cowardice. The tension between these two interpretations, maturity versus compromise, sophistication versus surrender, created an internal conflict that began affecting not just his work, but his entire daily routine. He found himself arriving at the studio earlier and staying later, as if extended hours could somehow resolve questions that had nothing to do with time or effort. His meals became irregular, his conversations with staff more distant, his legendary attention to detail replaced by a kind of anxious perfectionism that never seemed to achieve satisfaction. His assistant, Eddie, noticed the change and ventured a tactful inquiry one afternoon as Chaplin reviewed the same 3 minutes of footage for the 7th time. "Sir, if I may say so, you seem to be working under some additional pressure lately. Is there anything I can do to help?" Chaplin looked up from the editing bench, momentarily disoriented by the interruption. "Pressure? No, I don't think so. Just the usual challenges of getting the work right." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't entirely true. There was something else, something he couldn't name or address directly because it existed in the realm of implication and suggestion rather than concrete fact. The answer to his unease came on a cold February evening, delivered not through any dramatic confrontation, but in the form of a routine cultural event that would reveal the true nature of his situation with startling clarity. He had accepted an invitation to attend a private screening at a small theater in Beverly Hills, the sort of informal gathering common among Hollywood professionals. Such events provided opportunities to see colleagues work, discuss technical innovations, and maintain the social connections that kept the industry functioning smoothly. Chaplin arrived fashionably late, as was his custom, slipping into a back row seat just as the lights dimmed and the evening's program began. The film being shown was competent but unremarkable, the sort of picture that would earn modest profits without advancing anyone's reputation. Under normal circumstances, Chaplin would have watched with professional interest, noting techniques worth emulating or mistakes worth avoiding. But halfway through the evening, he became conscious of a presence that somehow altered the atmosphere of the entire theater. It wasn't a disturbance, nothing so obvious or dramatic, but rather a subtle shift in attention, as if the 100 people in the audience had all simultaneously become aware of being observed by someone whose opinion carried unusual weight. Conversations during intermission became more guarded, laughter more restrained, applause more carefully modulated. During the interval, Chaplin discovered the source of this atmospheric change. Near the lobby's far wall stood a man in an expensive overcoat, surrounded by several well-dressed companions who maintained a respectful distance while positioning themselves close enough to participate in any conversation he might choose to initiate. The central figure was not particularly tall or physically imposing, but he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any gathering. His face was round and pleasant, almost ordinary in its features, but his eyes held an intelligence that seemed to catalogue and evaluate everything within his range of observation. Chaplin recognized him immediately from newspaper photographs, though seeing him in person was an entirely different experience from encountering his image in print. Alphonse Capone looked exactly like what he was, a successful businessman, attending a cultural event in the city where he had interests, yet his mere presence somehow diminished every other person in the room, making them seem less significant, less substantial, less worthy of attention. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded lobby, a moment of mutual recognition that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Capone nodded slightly, a gesture so minimal it could have been interpreted as simple politeness between strangers or acknowledgement between individuals who knew each other by reputation. Chaplin nodded in return, uncertain which interpretation applied and disturbed by his uncertainty. Capone made no move to approach him, spoke no words in his direction, simply resumed his quiet conversation with his companions, as if the moment of connection had never occurred. But Chaplin felt marked by that brief exchange, as if something significant had been communicated without the need for language. The second half of the evening passed in a blur of distraction. Chaplin found himself unable to concentrate on the screen, too conscious of the presence 3 rows ahead of him, too aware that he was spending an evening being observed by someone whose interest in his work might carry implications he preferred not to contemplate. When the lights came up for the final time, Capone was gone, having departed with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized his entire presence. But the memory of his calm attention lingered, along with the uncomfortable realization that Chaplin had just spent 2 hours being studied by someone whose judgment might matter in ways that had nothing to do with artistic appreciation. The message that followed this encounter arrived not as direct communication, but as information passed through the intricate networks of connection and influence that linked Hollywood to the broader world of American business and society. 3 days later, during what appeared to be a casual conversation with a mutual acquaintance, Chaplin received what amounted to a formal review of his recent work. "I was speaking with someone who mentioned your latest project," the acquaintance said, with the studied casualness of someone conveying information that had been carefully prepared. Apparently, there's been considerable admiration for the restraint and artistic maturity you've shown in your recent work. Restraint? Chaplin asked, though he suspected he already understood the implications. Well, you know how some of your earlier pictures could be rather pointed in their social commentary. People appreciate that you found ways to make your artistic points without being unnecessarily provocative or inflammatory. The words hit him like physical blows, not because they were threatening they weren't, but because they revealed with perfect clarity what had been happening to his work. He hadn't consciously decided to become less provocative or inflammatory. The changes in his artistic voice had felt like natural evolution, the kind of growth any serious artist might experience as he matured and gained deeper understanding of his craft and his audience. But now, he was forced to confront the possibility that this evolution had been influenced by forces he hadn't recognized, that his instincts had been unconsciously adjusted in response to awareness of who might be watching, who might be forming opinions, who might be drawing conclusions about his character and intentions based on the choices he made in his art. That weekend, Chaplin undertook a systematic review of his recent work, studying each scene with fresh eyes and looking specifically for the modifications he had made without fully realizing their cumulative impact. What he discovered was both subtle and undeniable, a pattern of choices that consistently softened criticism, muted satirical points, and transformed specific social commentary into generalized observation. The corrupt politician had become a fool rather than a villain, not because foolishness was funnier, but because fools were less threatening than villains. The police violence had been edited to emphasize comedy, not because comedy was more entertaining, but because comedy was less accusatory than drama. The industrialist had been made sympathetic not because sympathy improved the character, but because sympathy diffused any suggestion that the portrayal might apply to actual individuals. Most disturbing of all was his inability to pinpoint exactly when or why he had made these changes. They had emerged gradually, organically, as if his artistic sensibilities had been quietly recalibrated without his conscious knowledge or explicit consent. It was as if some invisible hand had been guiding his choices, not through force or direct instruction, but through the simple knowledge that someone was paying attention, someone was forming judgments, someone was deciding whether his work fell within acceptable boundaries of taste and discretion. The discovery prompted a crisis of artistic confidence, unlike anything Chaplin had experienced in his professional life. For the first time since his early days in the motion picture industry, he found himself questioning not just individual creative decisions, but his entire approach to his craft. Was he an artist who happened to work in a commercial medium, or was he an entertainer whose artistic pretensions were ultimately subordinate to broader considerations of business and social acceptability? The question tormented him for days, interfering with his sleep, disrupting his work, making it impossible to view his own footage with any confidence in his judgment. But gradually, as the initial shock of recognition faded, it was replaced by something more valuable: determination. If his instincts had been unconsciously altered by awareness of unwanted attention, then consciousness of that alteration was the first step toward reclaiming his authentic voice. He could not undo the changes that had already been made, but he could recognize them for what they were and make deliberate choices about how to proceed. The process of artistic recovery proved more difficult than he had anticipated. His recently adjusted instincts resisted the return to boldness, whispering doubts about the wisdom of work that might provoke unwanted interest or unfavorable judgment. But gradually, through conscious effort and deliberate commitment to his original vision, he began to restore elements of his work that had been unconsciously compromised. Not everything, some of the changes had genuinely improved the film, and he was honest enough to acknowledge that fact. But enough to reclaim what he now recognized as his authentic artistic voice, the perspective that had made his work significant rather than merely successful. When the film was finally completed and released to the public, it received the kind of response that vindicated his decision to resist the subtle pressure toward compromise. Critics praised its sophisticated blend of entertainment and social observation. Audiences embraced its combination of laughter and insight. And box office receipts justified the faith his financial backers had placed in his commercial instincts. By any conventional measure, the picture was a complete success. But Chaplin found himself paying attention to responses from one particular quarter with an intensity that surprised him. The informal feedback that reached him from Chicago was noticeably different from the enthusiasm that had characterized reactions to his earlier, softer work. Not hostile, nothing that could be interpreted as criticism or disapproval, but distinctly cooler, less engaged, suggesting that his decision to reclaim his authentic voice had been noticed and evaluated by the same quarters that had previously expressed such warm appreciation. The cooling of that particular audience's interest felt more significant than any negative review in any newspaper, more meaningful than disappointing receipts in any market. It confirmed that he had indeed been facing a test he hadn't recognized at the time, a quiet evaluation of his willingness to modify his work in response to subtle pressure. By softening his satirical voice, he had gained approval from sources where approval might be more dangerous than criticism. By restoring his authentic perspective, he had demonstrated that he understood what was at stake, but had also revealed his awareness of forces that preferred to remain invisible. Years later, when Charlie Chaplin had achieved a perspective that comes only with time and distance, he would look back on that period as among the most crucial of his entire career, though not for reasons that would ever appear in any official biography or public interview. He had learned something that would influence every subsequent project he undertook: that the most insidious form of censorship is not the kind imposed by external authority through law or regulation, but the kind that emerges from within when an artist becomes too conscious of being watched by audiences whose approval might carry costs he is not prepared to pay. The danger had never been direct interference, explicit demands, or obvious threats. It had been the subtle psychological pressure that comes from knowing that someone with genuine power is paying close attention, forming opinions, drawing conclusions about character and judgment based on creative choices that were never intended to serve as measures of political reliability or social acceptability. That knowledge, once acquired, proved impossible to ignore completely. Even years later, in moments of creative decision-making, Chaplin would sometimes catch himself hesitating before a particularly sharp piece of social commentary, wondering who might be watching, how they might interpret what he was trying to say, whether this joke or that scene or this character might be understood in ways that could prove. But he had learned to recognize these moments of hesitation for what they were, and to push through them toward the authentic expression that remained his primary responsibility as an artist. The hesitation never disappeared entirely. Some forms of awareness once gained become permanent, but it no longer controlled his choices or compromised his voice. This account explores the delicate relationship between artistic expression and the subtle forms of influence that can emerge when creative work attracts attention from sources whose approval might carry implications the artist never intended to invite. Drawing on the complex cultural dynamics of 1000, 930 Seconds America, to examine questions that remain relevant in any era where power and art intersect.